on social policy in Trinity College, Dublin. He was present at the foundation of the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association in 1967 and at the first Northern Ireland Civil Rights marches in Coalisland-Dungannon and in Derry in 1968. He's going to speak on the origins of the civil rights movement in Britain through the Connolly Association and its early development in Ireland. So, thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman and friends, Tá áthas mór an bhar an óna caint faoin feachtas ceata hí bhíalta tuisce na hÉireann, chuige bliana hin, a thosaíodh an feachtas sin. It's not so much the civil rights movement, it's the particularly 5th of October event, which of course was yesterday. 50 years ago yesterday you had the RUC assault on the Duke Street demonstration, the march in Duke Street, Derry, which was televised by RTE and which brought the deplorable civil rights situation in the north to British and to mass British and to world attention. And there's going to be quite a lot of civil rights commemorating this weekend. I'm happy to say the Irish Examiner asked me to do an article, a 1,500-word piece, which is rather long, which today's paper carries, the Examiner, and which more or less goes over some of the points I want to make in my talk this afternoon. And the President Higgins, Michael D. Higgins, is speaking in Derry this afternoon, and no doubt the Sunday papers will tell us what he said. And I gather the Sinn Féin party is having a reenactment of the Duke Street March at this very moment, with their presidential candidate, Liam Ní Riada, coming all the way from Cork to take part in it. So there'll be quite a lot of interest. 50 years ago, yes, I spent my working life teaching in TCD, and I haven't much of faith in lecturing as a mode of efficient communication, so I've always been a person for handouts. So you've got an 11-page handout there which gives a lot of notes on the early period of the civil rights movement. There's some typos in it, for which apologies. When I was getting a photocopy this morning, I forgot to photocopy the cover of two pamphlets from Connolly Association pamphlets from the early 60s, which are referred to in the things. I just forgot. But, and of course, this is not a comprehensive account of even the early civil rights movement, but it does seek to highlight important trends and developments. And I think there'll be some bits of information there which will be new to most of you. A few general points, and I'm just going to make a few points related really to these notes. The first is that I believe, in my judgment or view, that the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland in the late 60s was entirely an indigenous development. There's a kind of theory going around that there was a kind of international fever of agitation and discontent indicated by the anti-Vietnam War protests, the anti-apartheid movement internationally, the 1968 events in Paris, the American civil rights movement, and that in some way there was a kind of contagion which affected people in the north of Ireland, and they went looking for civil rights. This, I think, was put very vividly last month in RTE's programme, which Owen Harris called Miriam O'Callaghan in America, which some of you may have seen. You know, the suggestion was that there was an immolation of the civil rights movement in America in the north at that time. I think this is it's not really an explanation. It's an attempted explanation by people who don't really want to do the work of finding out what really happened. So in my judgment, there would have been a civil rights agitation of the kind that eventuated in the late 60s, even if nothing of these things happened. People did sing the song "We Shall Overcome," but that was about the extent of American influence, in my opinion, at least in the early stages of the civil rights movement. Second point is that you're aware, generally, I suppose, of the abuses that the civil rights movement was set up to remedy. They're listed, the main ones are listed on page 2 of those notes. As you know, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 partitioned Ireland, and for the next 50 years or so, the nationalist Catholic population in the north of Ireland suffered under majority unionist rule. They, predominantly nationalist towns like Derry and Enniskillen, Armagh and Dungannon were gerrymandered to ensure there was always a unionist majority. This was facilitated by the fact that you had a multiple franchise, up to 6 votes in local government, a property franchise in local government elections, and unionists tended to be more well-to-do than nationalists at that time. And you had widespread discrimination, the allocation of housing and jobs to facilitate this. At the same time, you had the Special Powers Act, which permitted the Stormont majority unionist administration to arrest people without warrant, intern them without trial, ban nationalist demonstrations and organisations, flying the Irish flag was illegal, and so on and so forth. And I looked up the Orange Order in Wikipedia and found an interesting paragraph which is mentioned on page 2, which I copied, about all the Orange men who'd been in charge of Northern Ireland during most of its existence. I just copied it there on page 2 of those notes. So the civil rights movement was set up really to remedy these ills and injustices. It became world news as a result of the October the 5th demonstration, which was cut by RT's cameras, as I said, 50 years ago yesterday. And Captain Terence O'Neill, who was the Northern Ireland Prime Minister at the time, was under pressure for reform. He was under pressure from the civil rights movement, which had blown up in August and October, and the first two major civil rights marches. 1968, and also, of course, he was under pressure from the British government. The new Labour administration that came into office in '64, had done nothing in the meantime, nothing much. But there was a solid block of Labour MPs and people who were pressing for reforms. And so O'Neill was caught between two pressures. And in my opinion, there's no decent book that does justice to the whole complexity of the complex civil rights movement. Highly desirable there should be. But anyone that does will have to pay reference to the movement in Britain that had been going on for 10 years or more, seeking to win, to expose the injustices and discrimination in the north of Ireland in British labour and trade union circles. And that was the reason why, when Jerry Fitt, who was in the front line of the marchers in Duke Street 50 years ago yesterday, had 3 Labour MPs with him, Annan Russell Kerr and John Ryan. We hear about some other people who were on that march, but it's rarely been pointed out that there were 3 Labour MPs accompanying Fitt, and that wasn't by accident. They represented, so to speak, a good block of unionist Labour MPs, many of them left-wingers, but not entirely, who were well aware of what was happening in Northern Ireland and wanted reforms and were pressing Wilson for reforms. Of course, Wilson and the Labour government didn't want to do anything. They wanted to sustain unionism as much as possible and avoid intervention, but they were under pressure from some of their backbenchers to intervene, and that's an important part of the civil rights story, which has generally been ignored, but I hope maybe drawn more to the attention of people as a result of this weekend's events, commemorative events, and future research and so on. As I said, there's a library of books on the provisional IRA's campaign from 1970 to 1994, but there's no decent book on the civil rights movement. And any such study would need to do justice to the British side of things. I think it's fair to say that Desmond Greaves, who was editor of the Irish Democrat and the chief ideologist, if you like to say, use that word, of the Connolly Association, was the person who it's fair to say that he thought up the idea of a civil rights movement, right? The idea of concentrating on civil rights as the way to undermine unionism and expose the reactionary character of the Northern Ireland regime at the time. And this is quite well documented in the Irish Democrat. And the idea of winning support in Britain for a policy of ending partition in Ireland and in the meantime improving the civil rights situation of nationalists in the north of Ireland was reflected in the new constitution of the Connolly Association, which was adopted as far back as 1955. I myself walked in London, having shaken the dust of Cork off my heels in 1958. I was working in London from 58 to 61, was very active in the Connolly Association at that time. I was its full-time paid organiser for 1 year. And the main thing they were concentrating at that time was the campaign to get the release of the internees. There were something like 200 or so internees in Crumlin Road Jail, Belfast, in 60-61 as a result of the 56-62 border campaign of the IRA. And these were interned under the Special Powers Act without charge or trial, and they'd been in prison for years. And Greaves thought the idea of finding out that some of them were members of British trade unions. And it opened up the possibility of going to British trade unions and saying, do you know that some of your members in the north of Ireland and Belfast are in prison without charge or trial for years? And of course they didn't know. But that was a very useful message to be getting across. Because of course, the convention, the injustice of the north of Ireland at the time relied very much on the convenient parliamentary convention that which the British Parliament sustained and the British government sustained, that matters that were devolved to Stormont could not be raised at Westminster. It was possible for MPs from the north of Ireland, there are 12 of them, could raise anything to do with Manchester or Birmingham issues, but MPs from Birmingham and Manchester could not raise anything that had been devolved to Stormont under the devolution administration under the Government of Ireland Act 1920. So this is a convenient way of letting sleeping dogs lie and making sure that the unjust situation in the north of Ireland could go on, and it went on for 50 years. There were IRA campaigns against it, which the northern government was well able to handle. There were periodic constitutional agitations by the nationalists, boycotts of Stormont and so on, which they were also able to handle, but they weren't able to handle the civil rights movement and the civil rights demands when it came along. Because that was a demand essentially for British rights for British citizens, as long as the people, nationalists and Republicans and Catholics and so on, were under this, were in the United Kingdom in the North of Ireland. They should have the same rights as everybody else. There should be equality of treatment, parity of esteem, to use the current jargon phrases for equality. But as far back as 1961, and I was personally involved in this, over half the Parliamentary Labour Party in the House of Commons signed telegrams to Brooke Borough calling for the release of the internees. And this was years before there was any significant movement for civil rights in the North itself. On points 4 to 11 of those notes, I document the main elements of this Connolly Association campaign to win support in British labour and trade union circles for an inquiry into the Government of Ireland Act and for legislation that would remedy the situation at Westminster. And it was not just the Connolly Association itself, of course. The association was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties and the Movement for Colonial Freedom, which were important bodies in Britain at the time. And that gave it kind of leverage to spread this message, and that's mentioned in those notes, points 4 to 11. And that meant that when Gerry Fitt was elected for West Belfast in 1966, the year of the 50th anniversary of the Rising, and went to London, he found a group of Labour MPs, indeed a couple of Liberals as well, but Labour MPs who were supportive of him and who were aware of what was happening under Stormont. And this was a big change on the situation 20 years before. In 1949, after the war, World War II, the Labour government at the time, the Attlee administration, had passed the Ireland Act, saying that, because it was very pro-unionist, the Unionists stood by Britain in the war and all that, and the Ireland Act said there should be no change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland without the consent of the Northern Ireland Parliament, without the consent of Stormont. That was 1949, the Labour government in 1949. In 1969, 20 years later, when the civil rights movement blew up in the North, there was a solid block of Labour MPs pressing for reform and pressing Wilson to do something. So that was a change in 20 years in British, that took place in Britain. It was largely due, I suggest, to the work of the association and those it influenced, and that is generally ignored in treatment of the issue, though I'm glad to say that this article in today's Examiner does refer to it. The Civil Rights Association, there were of course other developments. The Civil Rights Association was formed in NICRA, Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed in 1967, there had been some earlier moves towards trying to highlight the civil rights issues which are mentioned in the notes. It resulted from a coming together basically of the politicising Republicans of the 1960s. This was the Republican movement led by Cathal Goulding, McGilla and Sean Garland, and they had basically were going political, and a part of that process was taking up the civil rights issue. And then there was the interest of the Wool Toad Society and so on, which was part of that politicisation process, and they supported the idea of a civil rights campaign. And then there were the trade unions, the Belfast Trades Council, many of them left-wingers, but generally Protestant background. And essentially the Civil Rights Association came about, and its formation in '67 as a result of the coming together of those two ideological streams, so to speak. It was set up in '67, the founding meetings in January and April '67, and as I mentioned in the notes there, and probably you know, it had a wide, there was a representative of every political party in the north of Ireland in it at the time, and it co-opted a young unionist for a period. And it sponsored the first two civil rights marches, which drew the whole business of world attention. The August one from Coalisland-Dungannon, and the 5th of October one, which we're specifically commemorating today. It was, of course, a new technique. I'm glad to see Patrick Murphy as a commentator in today's Irish News. He's got a column every Saturday examining the origins of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association shows that it was the first attempt at normal politics in a society which had been in sectarian deep freeze since 1922. And for the first time, it used peaceful protest rather than violent paramilitarism to confront the state. This view argues that the 30-year sectarian war that followed arose not because of the civil rights movement, but despite it. I think that's a fair judgment. Well, you're aware of the Duke Street events, and I mentioned them in the bottom of that page whatever it is. And the Unionist government found it difficult to deal with that issue. You know, equal rights for British citizens, British rights for citizens of the North, regardless of whether they're Protestant or Catholic. This appealed to the sense of fair play of the British public, and it was not easy for the Unionist Terence O'Neill to handle it, and he was also under pressure himself from some of his rivals in his own party. Paisley, of course, was exploiting every opportunity that he could find to rouse sectarian antagonism between the two communities. And however, by the middle of 1969, I think you could say that all the Northern Ireland government, under pressure from the British government, had accepted all the essential civil rights demands which are set out there, and including, of course, the ending of discrimination, getting rid of gerrymandering and so on. It took years, of course, for these to be practically implemented. But in principle, the civil rights programme was accepted relatively early on, within a year, really, of the march's beginning. But of course, during that period, you had a marked rise in sectarian temperature. And of course, as well, in that context, of course, you must refer to the People's Democracy, which was founded immediately after the 5th of October events, and the students in Belfast. And I quote Eamon McCann there on page 7. On the People's Democracy, as he said, our conscious and unspoken strategy was to provoke the police into overreaction and to spark off a mass reaction against the authorities. There was, of course, a tension between the Civil Rights Association, the NICRA, which had a more moderate approach, and the People's Democracy, which is really led from within by in a group of left-wingers, as McCann indicates in his book, War in an Irish Town. After O'Neill accepted some of the civil rights demands and dismissed Home Minister William Craig, as occurred in December 1968, 2 months after the October the 5th event in Derry, the Civil Rights Association executive called for a moratorium on demonstrations for a period to let O'Neill's programme walk through and see what the colour of his money was, so to speak. And it was in that context that you had the first Burntollet March, or the Burntollet March, from the first few days of 1969. And while no one can deny the courage of the marchers, it did help to raise the sectarian temperature significantly. I think there's no doubt. And then there was, because the People's Democracy didn't believe in stewarding and so on, and there were of demonstrations. And there was another demonstration in Uri where police, in January '69, where police tenders were hijacked, and the police stood by, knowing this would be bad publicity for the civil rights people. And then in February, you had the election of Michael Farrell and Kevin Boyle to the NICRA executive, because they had become national figures. And the third NICRA AGM in February, I think, '69, a month or so after the Burntollet March, Michael Farrell and Kevin Boyle were elected to the executive and proposed the whole of a march up the Newtownards Road to Stormont, right to the heart of Lloyd's West Belfast. This precipitated the resignation of 4 members of the Civil Rights Executive, more moderate, including Betty Sinclair and 3 others. And then the march was called off. But there was a shift in the policy and orientation of the Civil Rights Executive at that time, in face of the stresses and strains of the time. Fundamentally, of course, the ultimate responsibility for the violence in the north of Ireland, from wherever it came, was with the British government, successive British governments, which allowed this intolerable situation to build up over 50 years. I remember asking the late Bobby Heatley, could the violence have been avoided? And he said he thought that there was such sectarian tinder built up over the period and such resentment that there was going to be an explosion of some kind. What form it took, of course, was determined by local political events. But the situation deteriorated hugely during 1969 and then culminated in the Battle of the Bogside and the Falls Road incidents in Derry and in Belfast, rather, when you had the burning down of the houses in Bombay Street and so on. Hundreds of Catholics, if not thousands, were expelled from their housing, and the British government had to send in the army to replace the police force in Derry and Belfast. And in that of course led to the regrettable split in the provisional IRA in late December, early January 1970, which gave us the provisional IRA and the subsequent 25 years of armed struggle. And I conclude my notes there by just making some comments on that, because I think the current Sinn Féin leadership is seeking to appropriate the civil rights movement in the sense of trying to give itself a new myth of origin, to use the word, that the Sinn Féin and the modern provisional IRA and so on arose from the civil rights movement. I think this is quite unhistorical. The split in the Republican movement, the pre-split Republicans, of course, supported civil rights and the whole political approach. The split in the Republican movement didn't occur until December 1969, January 1970, really 2 years or so after the civil rights marches or the civil rights agitation as such had got going. And the approach, of course, of the newly formed provisional IRA was essentially to embark on expelling the Brits from the north of Ireland rather than a political civil rights approach. So even though at this very moment in time our Sinn Féin friends are gathering in Duke Street, Derry to reenact the civil rights march that took place then with their parliamentary candidate for the European Parliament, Lian Ní Riada, there as well, I understand from today's Irish news, I think it's quite unhistorical to be claiming, or attempt to claim that the modern Sinn Féin, whatever about the IRA, emerged from the civil rights movement. I think that is not the case, and I make some points about that on pages 10 and 11, including some points about the attitude of the current Sinn Féin leadership to the European Union. I just conclude with the last point, point 18, because in a sense I think the Good Friday Agreement, or certain key elements of it, is a form of what I call civil rights rediviva, civil rights revived. After 25 years of armed struggle, we're back, so to speak, to a civil rights approach again, a political approach, and it's accepted by all parties, I think, including by the relevant governments, that equality of treatment, parity of esteem must prevail in the north of Ireland. And that is essentially what the civil rights is all about. That the only way in which we could get a gradual coming together, however long it took, of the two communities was if there was equality between them. Because if there weren't equality, if Protestants or Unionists were privileged over Catholics, well then they got something out of the system. They were top dog over Catholics, nationalists, and top doggery existed for well over 50 years until the civil rights movement began to undermine it. Get rid of top doggery, get rid of the domination of the nationalist Catholic population by the Unionists, and at least you provide a basis on which there's no particular benefit to a lot of Unionists, at any rate, from the continuance of partition. If they are Irish people, as we all agree they are, well then over time it should in principle be possible to win them to a position of support for not just equality in the north of Ireland, but eventually for some form of Irish reunification. That was really the thinking behind of those like Greaves and others behind who supported the civil rights movement. Civil rights were worthwhile in themselves, but that was also getting them and getting equality of treatment and parity of esteem between the two communities was the only way in which over time you could get a united Ireland by consent. And attempts to get a united Ireland without consent have been made and are bound to fail. And that's just the only way in which united Ireland can ever be brought about. And to that context, that, as I say in the top of page 11, I think it's very regrettable the way in which the current Sinn Féin leadership has supported Brexit, or opposed Brexit rather, because I think by the opportunistic step, they threw away the possibility of developing a new relation with the Unionists. They removed, of course, the major political obstacles to them forming a coalition with one or other of the main parties down here. They aligned themselves, it must be remembered, that by opposing Brexit, the Sinn Féin leadership aligned itself with the Tory government of Britain, led by Mr. Cameron, with Obama in America, with Goldman Sachs, with the Brussels Commission, with the City of London. All these people did not want Brexit. They were all against it and very anxious it couldn't come into being. And by opposing Brexit, Sinn Féin, leadership at any rate, whatever, I don't know if there was much discussion on the members, they aligned themselves with those interests, and still do. And at the same time, they threw away the opportunity of having quite a new dynamic relation with the DUP. I think myself, the Sinn Féin leadership said, oh, well, the Remainers are bound to win, we'll be on the winning side. And they'll be egg in the face of the DUP. That was possibly one of the motivations. But they removed the possibility of a new relation between the two. And suppose the Sinn Féin leadership in 2016 in the UK referendum had said, we'll support Brexit, and we'll tell our people why we're doing so and explain it. You have to tell people why you're following a particular course of action. They probably would have a majority in the north of Ireland for Brexit. So the Sinn Féinists and the DUP would then have the majority in the north for Brexit. And that would have been a realistic estimate. And they could then have turned around to the southern establishment and said to the southern government, the government in Dublin, follow us, follow the north out of the UK, out of the EU rather. And put the southern political establishment totally on the spot. That was not done. That's water under the bridge. But these are some of the implications of what I call shifting from a particular political approach. There's many implications. The Good Friday Agreement is civil rights red vivus, as I suggest. Equality of treatment, parity of esteem, and that is the only way to unite Ireland. Though there's absolutely no doubt, in my opinion, that the events of the last 30 years, in my opinion, have put that day a long way into the future. Thank you very much.
Kevin McCorry is a former full-time organiser with NICRA, and he's a former member of Republican clubs and a member of the People's Movement. He's going to be speaking on the strategies and tactics of the civil rights movement as it developed.
Hey, given the location and to round out, I'm going to take the story of civil rights from '69 onwards because I think Tony has very adequately dealt with the situation up to '69. But before I launch into that, I just sort of draw your attention, given, as I say, where we are at the moment. In 1962, the predecessor of the Communist Party, or one of the predecessor parties, the Communist Party of Northern Ireland, held its 11th Congress in Belfast and adopted a new programme, Ireland's Path to Socialism. And I don't know whether or not somewhere in the vaults of the premises there would be copies of that document, but it makes for a very interesting read insofar as it highlights the lack of democracy as the Achilles heel of the Northern Ireland Unionist regime, and calls for mass struggle against that. And in the context of what Betty Sinclair and the Belfast Trades Council were going to be doing later on, in '65, and then the formation of NICRA later on, that was a clear sort of guide to the way forward. But even more significant, and if a lot of academics who have been written on the period would actually bother their Barney and look at a document like that, it highlights the fact that the north of Ireland was not a state, but a statelet, because it spells out in black and white Article 75 of the so-called Constitution of Northern Ireland, which vested supreme power and authority with Westminster, and showed quite clearly that if you were going to push for reform, you had to put pressure on Westminster for that reform. It indicated a strategy that would include a struggle for civil rights in the north, a struggle with Britain in solidarity with that struggle, and also a struggle in the south to support the national objectives, and in those particular case, in these particular circumstances, being civil rights. And another sort of way of putting in context as well, I saw a review of a book by Paul Bew and Henry Patterson and the other fellow whose name I forget. The state in Northern Ireland in the thing. And the review is very good insofar as it says that their objective of trying to write out what is and what has been the traditional Republican or national democratic perspective in relation to North, and indeed in relation to Irish developments. And of course, they fall into that trap of talking about this Northern Ireland state as being in some way a normal political situation for the Unionists and for there, and that civil rights was, if you like, some sort of ethnic aberration, that the natives were just waiting, gagging to get into violence. And they talk about, and the tinder that brought this into play was, as they describe it, the ultra-leftist elements of the PD. So in other words, you had this, you know, almost tribal, primordial section of the population in the north just gagging to get into violence. And civil rights, hence then from that, the whole civil rights era is just an interlude between pure unionist domination of the political scene and the long war, or the whatever you want to call it. But in fact, it was no such thing. It was perhaps one of the most significant political movements that emerged in this country in the last 2 centuries. Because it was a classic mass movement with all the elements there of bringing about fundamental change. And Tony went through some of them. And clearly, members of the Communist Party can be proud of the role that communists played in that civil rights struggle. Now, when Tony suggested that he would deal with the early period, and I'll let you talk about 69 onwards, my immediate, I suppose it's the pessimism of old age. My immediate thought was, well, I'll be dealing with the decline of an organization going off the political Richter scale. And that was my initial thing. And then I thought about it, because 1970 was a pivotal year. And we're talking about suggestions for progressive academics who would be worth their salt. In itself, 1970 as a year in Irish history would be well worth careful analysis. It started almost on a ludicrous note. Captain Terence O'Neill, who had been ousted earlier on by Chichester Clark, went to the House of Lords, as befits somebody of his station, and he joined the board of some bank in London, and he waltzed off the political scene. And that was, I think, that was January of that year. But more significantly for the civil rights movement, and for NICRA in particular, the legacy of what Tony is talking about, the ultra-leftism that had been on the sort of fringes of NICRA, and then had come into the centre of NICRA, and had operated in a way which was detrimental to the interests of democratic struggle, because there were people who didn't know the first thing about what was involved in democratic struggle. Remember, these were people who, for the most part, and I'm talking about the sort of the core, inner core of the people's democracy, these are people who had come from the Young Socialists, the Northern Ireland Young Socialists. Now, I don't want to go into the sort of, sound as if somebody who's sort of following the goings-on of small groups, but it's important just to know where the politics of these people were coming from. The Northern Ireland Young Socialists were the youth wing of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. And the Northern Ireland Labour Party was the most constitutional party in the north of Ireland, constitutional being pro the Union. They were scared stiff of being seen as in any way standing for, well, first of all, suggesting the integrity of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. But they even went further. They wouldn't even highlight or campaign or say anything about the Special Powers Act, about the B specials, about the rest, because that way they could be disloyal. So here were people who were advocating socialism. And I think some of them are actually advocating a workers' republic within this Northern Ireland Labour Party. Now that's bound to cause political schizophrenia of the worst kind. So to say then that there were, that they could claim about, the other thing, had an understanding of politics. I don't know whether any of you are aware of a publication, Eugene used to sell it down below occasionally, the New Left Review. The New Left Review did an edition in 1969, which was the heading on the cover was Explosion in Ulster, the Militants Speak. And in it is the greatest load of nonsense about creating revolutionary centres and whether or not they were going to have secessionist areas or whatever. Now, I'm going on too long, but because maybe it's my age in terms of the thing. But the legacy, what I got back to 1970, the legacy of not being able, as an organisation, civil rights I'm talking about, not being able to control this sort of adventurism and this sort of nonsense, and being tarred with those sort of brushes, was bound to have a detrimental effect on the unity and capacity of NICRA to go forward. And true to form, 3 members of conservative members, of the NICRA executive, didn't go forward to the executive. So what was the effect of that? It narrowed the base of NICRA in the public perception, and it undoubtedly narrowed the base of NICRA as an organisation that's able to move forward and to drive the thing forward. And remember, all the other things, you had the Republican split. It's fair to say that a lot of the Belfast provisional leadership, part of their motivation, and it's usually attributed to the failure to defend, by the officials to defend the areas and all this, all this sort of thing. Another dynamic was anti-communism. NICRA had one member of the Communist Party on it. But the fact that there was one member of the Communist Party on it made it a communist organisation. The officials were also associated with NICRA. So therefore, it was a communist organisation because the officials were going the communist way. And I remember provisional people who became provisionals were saying, oh, the civil rights, sure, and the communists on that, sure, they could hold their annual meeting in a telephone box. And this was the sort of attitude. So from the very beginning, from the first or second month, you had the wider context of the Republican split. You had people siphoning themselves off from NICRA. You had the people who were later on in the year were going to form the SDLP. You had them beginning to distance themselves from NICRA. And by the end of 1970, when NICRA warned about the failure to deal with the special legislation and so on, and called a demonstration in Enniskillen. 3,000 people come out and marched in that demonstration. Effectively, the SDLP had sundered its connections with NICRA by that stage and was setting itself up consciously as a rival to NICRA. As well as that, the Stormont government had introduced emergency legislation, public order legislation, which effectively prevented sit-down demonstrations, increased the period of notice for marches, and so on, so that it was becoming again directed against civil rights type demonstrations. Effectively, what they were doing was they were trying to ensure that there would be no mass demonstrations against against them, and opposition would be confined to Stormont. And effectively, that opposition was, for the most part, was ineffective. When internment was introduced, NICRA, I suppose, had, and this is, we're jumping in a year. When internment was introduced, NICRA, the day after it, called for a campaign of civil disobedience. There was a massive rent and rate strike launched immediately. The SDLP and the others, the politicians, were forced by public opinion to follow suit. And that position, one of the things that was made clear there was that internment had to be the focus of campaigning and so on. And there should be no talks without, before internment ends. That was the agreed position by everyone, including Provisional Sinn Féin and obviously the SDLP. The first people to break that actually were Provisional Sinn Féin when they went and they talked to the Secretary of State without internment being introduced. They then opened the floodgates for the SDLP to do the same. And just, I don't know, is the 5 minutes still open for, or is it open for negotiation? Well, yeah, just in relation to the whole concept of a Bill of Rights, there was a political program. First of all, in terms of the justification used that the armed struggle was needed to defend the communities. The responsibility for the defence of communities rested with the British government. The point was that civil rights had highlighted the civil rights movement had highlighted the fact that the British government had to live up to that responsibility. When the paramilitaries substituted themselves for the British government and used, first of all, defence, and then defence turning into offence, they let the British off the hook. Effectively, they let the British off the hook in terms of the responsibility. Because remember, in '69, when the British came onto the street, British Army came onto the streets, who were the first people to riot against them? It was loyalists on the Shankill Road. Who was the first RUC man to be killed? And where was he killed? He was killed on the Shankill Road. So the political wisdom should have been, sit back and let the British confront those elements of loyalism that refuse to accept some sort of movement and some sort of way forward. Instead of that, they substituted themselves for the British, and by the end of the year you had a build-up, and then by the next year, '71, you had effectively, you had a whole new ball game. Internment then came in, and that added a totally new dimension to the situation, because that really brought down the wrath of God in terms of the violence, as everybody knew that it would. The British authorities, and probably prompted by the Unionists, believed that if they locked up a few people, that would sort the thing out. But as Bobby Heatley told Tony, the situation was such that people were not going to accept that. That's not an issue, but it's the wisdom of the political course that was adopted to respond to that which would be at issue. And just one, as I'm coming to just one final thing. Direct rule. When the two young lads were shot dead by the British Army in Derry, the SDLP withdrew from Stormont, and they set up an alternative parliament in the Castle Ballroom, I think it was, in Dungannon. I don't know what it was, an assembly of the Irish people. And one of their demands was no talks with the British while Stormont was in existence. they were, in other words, they were calling for direct rule from Westminster. Now remember, 71 was the year in which the British TUC called for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. A Bill of Rights which would be a straitjacket, which would hold the Unionists from introducing the measures that were the grievances that NICRA and the civil rights movement sought to get rid of. It would be a straitjacket that would hold them there. So rather than actually linking in with a movement or something that they could build on, they called for direct rule. The PDs called for direct rule. Provisional Sinn Féin called for direct rule. I went to, after internment, I got one of these immediate visas out to Washington to speak before one of these Senate subcommittees. Finish, thanks, is the message. And I said, they were saying, are you going to call for direct rule? I said, no, I actually believe that there is a course of action which the British government could introduce, which was to actually address the issues that are grievances. Jesus, you would have thought I had said I was there to represent the devil in Washington. Didn't want to know it. So Washington was clearly pushing for direct rule, while all the time the best demand that could have been made, a Bill of Rights, was being quietly pushed off the scene. So civil rights was part of, as I always understood it, in my understanding, it was part of the Irish democratic question. And civil rights in itself are key to a democratic advance. And they still remain so today. Thanks. Sorry about that.
And this is a formidable act, two formidable acts to follow. What I would say from the outset, and we're 50 years on from that first civil rights, or not the first civil rights march, from the second civil rights march, because the first one took place from Coalisland-Dungannon, but the most notable one, the 5th of October. From the outset, could I say that Northern Ireland, the statelet, the state, the political entity, call it what you will, had two underlying forces. Not simply Orangism, which was the dominant force within the 6 counties at the time, but also there was the dominant force of British imperialism. Northern Ireland was not a state, but it was as much a colony as it was an Orange institution. And as such, British imperial interests, while using the Orange state and using the Orange card as it had done for well over a century, from the time of Randolph Churchill, who used and coined the famous phrase, "We'll use the Orange card and pray God that it becomes the ace of trumps." Britain had a vested interest in maintaining a toehold and a position on this island. And after partition in 1921, it therefore saw the Orange state as its garrison on this island. So while its interests ran parallel with those of the Orange Order, which governed the 6 counties, they were somewhat different. But that, to my mind, will give us the reason why British governments turned a blind eye deliberately to what was happening on the northern part of this island. It wasn't that they were unaware of it, because as Anthony has outlined very adequately and very clearly, the British establishment, both Labour and Conservative and Liberal for that matter, were very well aware of the conditions within the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Harold Wilson had been prevailed upon from taking over in number 10 Downing Street to make profound change. But the reason they didn't was because they had a strategic objective in remaining in the 6 counties. Bear in mind that at that time, those that were in charge in Britain, both Labour and Conservative, had experienced the Second World War. Their military, the senior military people, had fought in the Second World War. They viewed Northern Ireland as a strategic asset in terms of defending what was still then viewing itself as a superpower, with certainly superpower ambitions. So when we ask the question, was Britain a neutral observer? Was it a neutral agent? Was it a benign agent? It most certainly was not. Its interests were first self-interests, as Britain has always seen its own interest as first and foremost. It is a naive mistake to believe that Britain would push its own self-interest behind those of its colonists, that it would see civil rights in Northern Ireland as being more important than Britain's self-interest in maintaining its position, its toehold, its military control over those 6 counties. And for that reason, Britain was neither a neutral, benign overseer, nor was it willing, and this is the key point to it, was it willing to enforce the programme that would have been necessary to make the change. So let's take it on that basis, that there was a vested interest in the sovereign power in London. So let's take it then into the next situation where we're talking about the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Now last week in the Irish Times there was an extensive interview with one of the key players of the time, Eamon McCann, and Eamon mentioned in the course of the interview that he was astonished, surprised greatly at the outbreak of violence. Eamon has many, many fine qualities, and I have a great admiration for him in many things, but the fact that he would be surprised that Northern Ireland would explode into violence is baffling. This part of the world had a long history of internal conflict, internecine conflict. 1886 we had venomous riots in Belfast. 1907 through the general strike in 1907, when there was the prospect of class unity, it was deliberately attacked, consciously attacked by the British Army to break it up on behalf of the industrialists of Belfast to smash the 1907 strike. There was the incidents of the 1920s when tens of thousands of Belfast Catholics were attacked in a pure process of terror to terrorise that population, to ensure that that state would have its purchase. Keep in mind what one of the Hibernians of the time, Joe Devlin, said about the 1920s when the death squads were coming, organised by the RIC, the new RUC and their B specials. Joe Devlin said that if you have a revolver in the house to protect yourself, you'll get 10 years penal servitude. If you don't have a revolver in the house to protect yourself, the B specials will come in and kill you. That was the outlook in Belfast of the 1920s. You come through to the 1934 when we had the outdoor relief riots. Again, the working class combined. 1935, the Protestant Action Force split and created pogroms and riots again. 1964, and this is indicative, when the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and God help them for what they were attempting to undermine Orange hegemony in Northern Ireland. The Divis Street riots were not just an aberration led by Ian Paisley. It was direct, it was conscious, and was deliberately constructed to attack that potential for unity. But keep in mind something else. 1966, which is not widely recorded. In 1966, the new UVF, the modern UVF, was formed. It was formed, believe it or not, very close to where I came from in County Tyrone. Founding members of the UVF in 1966, one of whom has left a record, the late Billy Mitchell, and he said it was formed deliberately to counteract the liberalising impact of Captain Terence O'Neill. That was 1966 when that was formed, and that meeting was attended by senior Orange figures, senior Unionist figures. What I'm saying here is that this state was, of its very nature, a violent and dangerous state. To believe that there could be a peaceful transformation, it's not beyond theoretical possibility, but it's asking an enormous amount to change. So then we take what happened in '68, and I do accept, and there's some responsibility has to be taken by those ultra-leftists who, without experience and who defied the advice coming from the more experienced members of the radical community, who defied the experience of people like Betty Sinclair to row back and broaden the base, to take this forward at a better, more sensible, sedate pace that could accommodate, to some extent, what was liable to happen. But pressed on and pressed on with the inevitable result that it was going to be attacked. But then let's go and take it without putting all the blame onto there. But we're talking here about what happens and the outcomes. And we're not, I would argue here, moral theologians. We're political pragmatists. We're looking at a situation and you're asking what could have been done and what was the likely outcome. 1969 was one of the pivotal years. And keep in mind that the initial bloodshed did not come from Republicans. The first people to die were killed by the RUC, by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, by members of the state, by the state agents, beaten to death in their homes in Derry. But the massive attack that came in 1969 happened in Belfast, in both West Belfast and in Ardoyne, dead at the hands of the RUC. Keep in mind what the RUC, this was not a civil police force, this was an armed militia, armed 30 caliber machine guns, Shoreland armoured cars. Two of the dead, one shot dead in his bed, a 9-year-old boy, the other a serving British soldier looking out the top window in Divis Flats. 2 men shot dead in Ardoyne the following night. Hundreds of houses burned out, thousands of people left homeless in that city. Now keep in mind that this was not some strange English town where the local bobby walked the street. This was the city of Belfast, where by 1969, within living memory of a generation, 3 times in the previous 50 years they had experienced pogroms in the 1920s, in the 1930s and the 1960s. So rationally, when we're talking of defence, and let me tell you this, you can contradict this if you like, but I was a member of the organisation. The priority at first was defence. Weapons were gathered up for defence. And if you ask rationally, to ask the people of West Belfast, of the Ardoyne, to put their faith in the British Army and the British government, you're asking a hell of a big question. That's a big ask, I can tell you. We don't have the right to bear arms on this island, and I don't disagree with it, but I'll tell you this, when you need defence, you'll ask for arms. It was dependent on their own resources, and can you blame people for asking for their own resources to defend themselves? Keep in mind, it wasn't just simply the provisional IRA. In those early days, there was a plethora of armed organisations, including the Catholic ex-service people. 69 was seminal in the sense that the bulk of the dead were on the nationalist, Catholic or Republican side and inflicted by the forces of the state. Arms were acquired, but there was not an offensive capacity initially. The provisional IRA, after it was formed, did not actually change its objectives until after Bloody Sunday, when it started to call for a British withdrawal and the United Ireland. Prior to that, their demands were actually arguably reformist. But a crucial year came in 1970, when, with a modicum of modest arms, and if you're asking for arms in a situation like Northern Ireland, keep in mind what's happening. Without the right to bear arms, where do you go to get arms? This obviously meant accessing arms illegally, and if you're asking to access arms illegally in the city of Belfast or in the 6 northern counties or across the island, where do you go? Who has the experience in accessing arms? You're certainly not going to go to the Catholic Church. You can't go to the GAA. You're not going to rely on the SDLP or the Nationalist Party. You can't ask the Hibernians. Who else is going to have the expertise in doing that but the IRA? By 1968, 69, this was an organisation which was bordering on being defunct. It re-emerged through almost grim necessity. But by 69, it started to rearm. The arms came from strange places. There was weapons lifted that had been buried for 30 and 40 years. There was dumps coming from Cork. There wasn't American arms coming. There were weapons coming from around the country from the strangest of sources. Splits that had happened over the previous 30 years had been patched over to put arms down. Weapons were coming up. I see names there that I think some men mentioned helped do it. But crucially, come 1970, and an orange demonstration supported by the UVF, and keep in mind what I mentioned about the UVF prior to this, the new UVF that was then coming along. An attack was made on the Short Strand, one of those small, isolated areas, always vulnerable, always fearful of attack. Now, classically, historically, the legend is that Billy McKee and 2 or 3 others held out an armed orange offensive on St. Matthew's, the church. Take it what you like. But what is significant is as that engagement was taking place between armed loyalists and this newly formed provisional IRA. Bear in mind, you were talking about Billy McKee, was an old middle-aged man at the time. The British Army had been committed, but the British Army sat back within view, eyesight of that gun battle and did not intervene. Now, I have spoken to no less than a colonel of the British, retired colonel of the British Army, and he argued with me that perhaps the officer didn't know the territory, he didn't know who was being engaged, he didn't know who was involved, he was a young officer in charge. And I can just about accept that. But what it meant clearly to the people of the Short Strand was that the British Army were sitting down the street and did not intervene to prevent an orange attack. But that's not the most significant fact. That after that night had ended and the Short Strand still was intact, the forces of Unionism then demanded to know where the weapons had come from to defend the Short Strand. And within days, a new Tory government had ordered a massive search on the Falls Road. And this led to what we know as the Siege of the Falls Road. 4-day siege, 4 people killed, 3-day siege, and the area cleaned of weapons. There was no follow-up into loyalist districts, into unionist districts. There was never mind an attempt made to curtail the state forces. And at that stage you were talking perhaps of having crossed what we could call the Rubicon. How do you bring it back? And at that stage the IRA carried the new provisionals declared what they call a policy of retaliation. For every house that the British Army raid and wreck, that they would hit back at a target, an economic target. For every Republican, Catholic or Nationalist shot dead, that a British soldier would be shot dead, and they carried it out until internment came in 71, by which stage there was an almost inevitability, the logic of conflict. Now, let me just mention a few things. That from the outset, the British were looking at this situation as a colonial situation. Keep in mind who was assigned to take responsibility for the military in Northern Ireland. Brigadier Frank Kitson. Now, when we're talking about Brigadier Frank Kitson, this isn't some guy that just happens to be a brigadier in the British Army. This is a man who wrote the rule book, Counterinsurgency Tactics for Unconventional Warfare, for insurrectionary situations. if you take time to read Frank Kitson, you'll start to begin to see the response that emerged over the number of years. Then let's see, as we move in a few years later into the late 70s and 80s, we'll come across Brigadier Gregory Kerr of the SAS. Brigadier, I heard of, within the last 2 or 3 years, I heard of Kerr. He was stationed in Afghanistan. He was advising on how to cope in Afghanistan. This is not a situation of pure civil rights, although it was there. It's not a question of simple democracy, although it was clearly a question that had to be addressed. Clearly, there was advantages. Without doubt, nobody can contradict the fact that a peaceful democratic process is by far and away the best process in terms of what is achieved and the cost and the price that has to be paid for achieving it. But let's keep in mind, we're talking pragmatism here. We're taking a hard-headed look at the situation. When we're looking at the history of that area, a long history of it, a community convinced that it was entitled to govern, that it was entitled, that it had a prerogative, it was entitled to be in charge, it was entitled to have unjust privileges. Some of it didn't benefit all of their members all that greatly, but it meant that if there was a job available, it went to those that supported the state. It meant that if there was a house available, it went to a supporter of the state. With that went a mentality that culturally that they were superior. A lot of this had been bubbling up, not for decades, but for a couple of centuries. Now, again, I'm saying I'm not a moral theologian. I'm not going to talk in terms of moral theology. We're talking here about very pragmatic things that had happened. And nor am I actually, by the way, I'm trying to explain rather than justify. I think it's possible always to explain or do your best to explain. Justification is something else, requires another issue. But we have now reached a situation where that state or the statelet or the political entity is clearly being shown to have run its course. It's a failed entity, it's a failed political entity. It was a failed and failing political entity from the day it was formed, but we have seen it at this point in time beyond doubt. If you take a look at what's happening in Stormont at the moment, where you have the RHI investigation, and that's the Renewable Heating Initiative investigation into the mismanagement of that particular fiasco. A committee overseen by the SDLP to supervise it saw nothing wrong. The civil service couldn't do anything about it. The special advisors couldn't do anything about it. The ministers in charge, and not one, but the minister in charge of the initiative didn't see anything wrong. The principal beneficiaries of the system was the Minister for Agriculture, who just happens to be now the Vice President of Sinn Féin, could see nothing wrong with it. If anybody could convince the impartial passerby that that system, that political entity is anything other than a collapsed, failed entity, not fit for purpose, adding to that, that as a result of what has happened over the last 50 years, and let's be very cautious that it come at an enormous price, but the techniques, the stratagems, and the mechanisms that the Orange State used to perpetuate itself have collapsed. The state is now heading towards its demise, its terminal decline. I think the lesson is this, that because of the nature of the place, and looking back at what happened 50 years ago, that if we don't address the upcoming issues, that there is almost a default position in that 6 counties towards violent, lethal force if we cannot address the issues democratically and through negotiation. We failed to do it 50 years ago. It's well worth looking at all the issues, but it's also well worth looking at it in such a way that we do not necessarily now begin to justify positions we took up 50, 40 years ago. We have to be honest and look at them. we have to say to our good friend Eamon McCann, Eamon, I don't know how you could be surprised that that society blew up in the way it did. We've got to look at the splendid initiative of the civil rights movement, but how it went the way it did. Take a look at the provisional IRA, how it evolved into what it evolved into. Taking all those lessons on board, we've got to take them on board, because we might just get another chance here in 10 or 15 years' time. There's going to be a border poll. That's the elephant in the room. There's going to be a border poll. Demographics are indicating that if there is a border poll, bear in mind that under the legislation there can only be a border poll if, in the opinion of the Secretary of State, there is a majority in favour of ending partition. So I mean, when there is a border poll, there's going to be a majority in favour of ending partition. It's one follows the other. So at that stage, we've got to be in a position, and we've got to do it now, that we start to address the future positively and negotiate it, rather than the alternative, which is just too awful to think about. So thanks.
If people have any questions, if you'd like to raise your hands, if you do not want to be recorded, please just note that at the start.
I've been thinking for a good while that the decision to go for a military option in the north of Ireland wasn't a decision taken by the UVF, it wasn't a decision taken by Ian Paisley or by the provisional IRA, it was a decision made by the British state. And looking at what was in the IRA at the time and how many people they had, how many guns they had, it would have appeared to Brigadier Frank Kitson and the British state that it would take a few months to mop up the IRA. And I think it was a deliberate decision, and that nobody talks in those terms now. They blame everybody else except the actual British state itself for the 30 Years' War, and they weren't thinking of a 30 Years' War, they were thinking of a 30 Days' War. But that was the miscalculation they made.
The first bombs planted in the north of Ireland were planted by the UVF in April, I think, April 1969, to get rid of O'Neill. To undermine it. They were blamed on the IRA at the time, which was quiescent at the time, hadn't yet divided. And as you know, the man who was one of those who planted them, Stevens, I think his name was, and I wish I never heard of that man Paisley, because he was put in trial for it. But of course, the government changed in June 1970, which is very important. Edward Heath came in, the Tory administration came in, and they had a much more hard line than one might have expected from Labour. So,
and 2 weeks later, they did the raid on the whole curfew in the Lower Falls.
Yeah, changed British government.
So it was changed British government.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things about it was that, in fact, the way it was, that curfew was broken, hundreds of women, it was a 34-hour curfew of the Lower Falls, and hundreds of women just literally walked through the army into the area with food and supplies for people who had no milk or whatever. You know, it was in terms of one of those images of you know, the best in progressive responses by people. It was phenomenal. But it was the Tories. As soon as they came in.
We could make one additional point. In 1969, I think it's fair to say that most of, or all of the demands of the civil rights movement had in principle been agreed by the British installment government under the Britain. And public opinion in Britain and internationally was very much on the side of the Nationalist Catholics in '69. But by 1971, certainly later 1971, the problem had become one of containing IRA terrorism. Because the movement, the Republican movement had split, all these other developments which Tommy referred to had occurred. And one can argue till tip's eve, what if something else had occurred, or something, could that have been avoided? But there was a big shift in the whole situation between those 2 years, and had huge international repercussions, because it meant that, you know, international and British perception of the situation had changed fundamentally. It was now a problem of containing IRA terrorism, and they're containing it for the next 25 years. They'll go back to civil rights again today.
But the point Sean's making, that the British calculated on a short, sharp shock treatment that could be brought to an end, and quite possibly that by bringing that particular aspect to a conclusion rapidly, that they could maybe even move on to something else, I think it's quite a reasonable. It's a reasonable observation. I think it probably is. I don't think the British anticipated. One, they didn't anticipate the extent of the resistance or the duration of the resistance. I think they definitely considered that it would be a shorter campaign than it turned out to be. But I go back to the point that it was a colonial calculation. The people they brought in had experience in Kenya and Aden and Cyprus. They had, if you like, the template. They took the template off the shelf. How do you deal with a colonial situation?
Yeah, and the British state and the British Parliament are not the same thing.
Of course. Of course.
Grant. John Meehan is my name. I can't let this meeting go without making a comment on what was said in particular about the Burntollet March and the role of what's laughingly being called ultra-leftism. I wasn't expecting to come to a stand-up comedy routine here, but I certainly got one. I will just say simply that there is a comrade on Belfast City Council who I've never actually met, Michael Collins. He's also a Labour historian. I just happened to read his account this morning of a very detailed description of the before and afters of the Burntollet March. It's a very moving account, actually, and because it's written with the eye of a historian, you can look backwards. You can't predict the future, but you can look backwards at history and what happened. And I'll just finish on this. One of the great whitewashes that the British state did over many decades in the north of Ireland was the Cameron Report. And I must say I am politically appalled to find it quoted approvingly here when there's a reference to it and it says their actions, referring to the marchers, raised the sectarian temperature significantly. I'll just finish on this. I've come across a lot of victim blaming in politics over the years, and this is one of the worst examples. I'd urge comrades to read Michael Collins' account of it, which includes new material about the behaviour of the state, the police and the British forces, and think again before making statements like that. Thank you.
Well, I just respond to that by asking the question, what was the purpose of that march? What was the political objective that they set out to achieve? That's the first thing. And in line with that, what was the political objective which was later, which was probably part of the same politics, which proposed a NICRA march up the Newtonards Road to Stormont? What was the political objective there? What would have been politically gained by that? To show that the North is a sectarian state? No issue there. So you always have to ask yourself the question, you know, the people who took part in that march were undoubtedly very brave. A number of them got treated extremely badly, to say the least of it. That's without dispute. But you have to ask yourself, in a meeting which purports to be a political meeting to discuss the politics of a particular campaign or a particular agitation, what was the political purpose of that Burntollet March?
Well, I just had, for purpose of doing these notes, I looked up Eamon McCann, and there's an extent on Google. There's a lot of material actually from his book, War on the Irish Town, which I had previously read. And I quote Eamon here on page 7. Our conscious if unspoken strategy was to provoke the police into overreaction and thus spark off a mass reaction against the authorities. I think that was undoubtedly the attitude of some of the leadership at any rate of the People's Democracy. And I think those actions did raise the sectarian temperature. Now you can speculate what difference would it have made if that hadn't happened. You know, these are might have beens, what ifery, and these things did happen. But I think there's little doubt that it raised the sectarian temperature, it raised the general temperature, and lots of other actions like the Newry demonstration and so on. But the temperature would have risen anyway, you might argue. But, you know, we can speculate what might have happened if other things had been done or hadn't been done. But Ian McCann himself is quite frank on these matters. On page 7 and page 8, I quote him. And, yeah. It was a loose organisation without formal members. At its core was a small group of determined left-wingers who had been in close liaison, etc., etc.
Thank you. Paul Stewart. Just to make the point that, you know, it's the old cliche that the benefit of hindsight is a great thing. And, you know, I think the response by the state, the demand for civil rights, was inevitable in hindsight. But you could say at the time, and I would support Tommy's point here, you know, if anybody thought that, if anybody was surprised by how the state reacted in that period, then I don't know what world they were in, what world they had been part of. And secondly, you know, demonstration up through East Belfast, people make mistakes, you know. You can point to this action that the PD took, which was, you know, you could say not everything a political organisation does is the right strategy, but you can't condemn what happened subsequently in terms of the response by people to the state on the basis of the failed strategy or the failed tactic of one particular organisation. And after all, when you say that perhaps the reaction of the state was inevitable, what makes you think it was inevitable? You say, well, if it hadn't reacted to the, you know, if they hadn't reacted to Burntollet and hadn't reacted in East Belfast, what would have made them react? Was there a revolutionary Marxist in every house in Leeson Street? Was there a revolutionary Marxist in every flat in Divis? You know, you can't. It seems to me we can't have it both ways. You can't say that there's this pent-up anger, repression, state repression over a 50-year period, and there was some misjudgments of political organisations that forced the state to overreact and treat people badly. I mean, we have to be, I think, respectful. We can't patronise. Either you patronise, you think they were wrong, or we think we are. Small groups of people actually do instill a consciousness into people. Unfortunately, that's not true. And it would have been nice if everybody in West Belfast and the Bog side had been a revolutionary Marxist, and it had been properly planned in the way they reacted to the state and petitioned the Stormont government, and they got the British state to support them. More Labour MPs did what they did in 1960. That would have been wonderful, but they weren't in political party, you know. So I think we, you know, the missing bit here from the first two speakers, who, you know, with respect, I think is actually why the state blew up, why it blew up at the time that it did. That's all. Thanks.
Well, the first thing about it is we have to be very careful. It was the British state that controlled the situation. And I cited that 62 document which quoted the legal situation, but politically it was the British who had the responsibility for what went on in Northern Ireland. But for all the years up to the birth of the civil rights, they were able to avoid their responsibilities in relation to what was going on and what was a rotten situation. But so to get back to this gentleman's question, what political action has to have some basis, it has to have an objective. So what was the objective of the civil rights? Now, there might have been, one of the might have beens that Tony talks about is, it might have been better if civil rights would have got off the ground in 1965, but it didn't. So as you quite rightly say, on a lot of occasions we have to make do with what's there. But one of the things that we have to make do with is we have to ask the political question, when we take a political action, what are we out to achieve? What do we want to get out of this? And if what we are doing, is that going to make us stronger or make our cause stronger, or is it going to make our cause weaker? And that's the question that goes to Burntullet.
Can I just answer it? The first civil rights march was the Dungannon and Coalisland one in August '68. And 1 year later, in August '69, you had the assaults on Bombay Street and hundreds of Catholic houses burned down. Now, in that 1 year, you had an extraordinary variety of things happened, of which we've mentioned one or two or one town. But the Paisley Arts, of course, were on the rampage as well and exploiting every opportunity they had, and the British, so a lot of things happened, but there's no doubt the sectarian temperature rose, which culminated in the August events, which in turn led to the splitting the Republican movement a few months later, and the British Army replacing the police force in Belfast and Derry. 1 year. But there's no doubt that the sectarian temperature rose. But the British government had accepted, by August '69, it had accepted all the demands of the civil rights movement. It accepted there should be reform of the police, new local government, and anti-discrimination, one person, one vote. It was going to take time for these demands to be implemented. It took years before you had, commissions ensuring that there'd be fair allocation of jobs and housing, etc. But the civil rights program was in principle accepted within 1 year. But the temperature, of course, rose massively during that year and culminated in the August '69 events, which in turn had all the consequences that led in effect to the IRA split and the 25 years that followed.
Yeah, but could I just say something to respect Anthony, that there is another factor in this, Bill Craig and the possibility of UDI. Whether the civil rights programme could have been enacted, given what was under the undercurrents, is something else. And Bill Craig was dismissed by Captain Terence O'Neill, and Terence O'Neill specifically used the term that Bill Craig was taking us towards a situation of unilateral declaration of independence, which was not, if you like, an abstract or esoteric concept in 1969 in the light of what had happened, what was then known as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Bill Craig organised the Vanguard movement. They actually unseated, well, they didn't, but with a combination of Craig and Paisley, they managed to unseat Captain Terence O'Neill. The actual obduracy of unionism to resist the civil rights programme, I think, can't be underestimated. But these are all, again, we're back to the what ifs. The one thing I would say about Burntullet is that with any action, ultimately, you can only blame the RUC, the state, the B specials in civvies who attacked people demonstrating for civil rights. But there is something else here. There's an onus on those who carry out an action to think of the consequences and not to thereafter disown the consequences. And I'm referring here to the people's democracy, who have evolved into a situation where they have moved away from the consequences, the inevitable, and I would argue virtually inevitable consequences of raising those issues within the context of a Northern Irish Orange state. There was going to be no sweet, happy ending. That's the fact. That when you're talking about the centuries of experience, Northern Ireland and the situation that was there didn't begin in 1920 or 1921. This was something that began a long way before that. Something that has been under-researched is the 19th century in those 6 counties, where virtually there was a situation not unlike what was happening in the southern states of the United States, where if a Catholic bought a Protestant premises, he or she was kicked to death, and that happened. Where if they attempted to take a job in a Protestant area, they find themselves beaten to death coming home from a fair. And the magistracy through that century totally ignored it. There was a situation here of Orange domination even before the state was set up. Now we can define it as sectarian, because it certainly was, but that, anybody could be surprised at what happened in 69, 70 and 71. It's, I would argue, naivety. But the other thing is that you've got to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions, whether the state's to blame or not.
I don't bother. No, just in relation to the attitude of the Southern government at the time to the civil rights, what happened about it, and I just think it was a disgrace. There was inaction and they didn't hold to account the people that were responsible. And now, just today, you have discrimination against people who are poor, north and south. Like, there's an article in today's paper about a woman, she's actually homeless herself and she's an activist, and they're trying to prejudice her. She's going on a show on Monday night to talk about it, and they're trying to, you know, so anybody now that tries to go up against discrimination, they're hounding them and it's poverty now is that, you know, they're just discriminating people that are poor and homeless, and it's just, it's north and south as well too, so like, I mean, that's, I think people have to rally now around the homeless issue and things like that, you know, that's, I just thought it was a disgrace, like the government at the time could have done something about civil rights and they just didn't, you know, so.
Yeah, I'd like first of all to compliment the three speakers. I think it's been a brilliant presentation, getting different aspects of the question involved. It's also heartening, I suppose, for somebody of my generation, people talk about the North and not dating the troubles from sometime in the mid-1970s when the shooting war started, but giving a bit of historical perspective. I remember being lifted along with Matt Davidson in Belfast on Paddy's Day 1967. Noisy special branch man sticking a gun into me nose in Hastings Street, Pledge Station's aim. That's all you Fenian bastards understand. There was no military campaign, there was no armed struggle around going on at the time. And when I tried to stand on my alleged rights, I'm a citizen of the Irish Republic, I was told where to get off. It says, you ever hear the Special Powers Act, so we can do whatever we fucking like, and that, pardon the French, is what he had to say. So, very much it's you. Tommy says about the northern state and what it's like, and the inevitability of it, how it reacted. And I don't think there's a question, notwithstanding Eamon McCann's uncustomary and apparent innocence at the time, I don't think the question is how did they think that the Northern State would react that way or not, or the Northern Stateless, or the British State, or all elements of the above. The question is not how they would react. I think that was probably fairly inevitable, given the history of that area. The big question was how the left and progressive forces would react to that state react. What was the strategy? Tom says, you have to ask the question first of all, what you're setting out to achieve. Talk about marching up the bleeding Newtownards Road. You wouldn't do it next week, never mind then in 1968, marching up the Newtownards Roads. It's lunacy and it's suicide. But the fashion at the time, and I hope people don't take offence, but maybe they will. I remember the view of those who was involved in the Connolly movement here at the time of Burntollet. We said, a bunch of middle-class tossers out of Queen's University decided they were going to lead a revolution. Same time of middle-class tosser students that were leading revolutions in their own imagination in Paris and in the United States and everything else. The new left, they read a few chapters of Herbert Marcuse and go out to change the world for a few years before they got back into Daddy's firm. That was our perception. We're all the boys to that employees. But I mean, there were people disconnected from the struggle of the ordinary people. They knew better than everybody else, and they were going to go out to provoke a reaction from the Irish state. And they got that reaction, and then what do you do for an encore? What do you do for an encore? They hadn't thought beyond that. And this theory of increasing social misery, the worse things are, the better it is, because you cause it a row, you throw a bucket of shit up in the air, when it lands, everybody will amazingly become revolutionary, and that'll be the end of capitalism. It's nonsense. And it led precisely to the type of reaction that it did lead to. But I think the weakness of the left and progressive forces was not in underestimating the reaction of the Irish stateless. It was not having a strategy to go beyond that when that happened.
Can I just say, I don't name my name, as someone who was reared in the 6 counties, and I was born in 1963, and I was the 10th of 12 children. The 9 that came before me, to understand where all this civil rights came from, and to understand the rise of the provisional IRA, we the 9 children before me were reared in porticabins and hovels in a place in Newcastle. Can you imagine what people lived in Derry and Belfast? Do you know what I mean? People forget the conditions of how people actually lived their daily lives. And I and my father, as a Catholic who worked as a breadman in Newcastle and County Down, come the 11th of July, the whole fellow workers wouldn't talk to him for 2 weeks because of the 12th. And then on the 12th fortnight was over, John, and him a shop steward for them. They just stopped talking to him because he was a Catholic, he had tag. So Tommy touched on it a small bit, but it's the one issue that you forgot to talk about, was the conditions of people who lived in the occupied 6 counties. And no better conditions were down here either, in the 26 counties. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's just a question really about the Burntollet situation, because I mean the criticism of them that they knew they were going to get a hiding. There was a good film out a while ago, well I don't know if it was that great, about Selma. Now when they marched in Selma, they knew that the police were going to overreact and the police were going to give them a hiding and the dogs would be set on them. So do you think that the same criticism should apply to the civil rights marches in America as you are applying to the people who marched in Burntollet?
Well, can I just, a comment on that is, there's a distinction between looking at the outcome of it and to criticise the march is something different. But it's whenever something provokes an action, there's going to be a response to it. And what is the response? And that's where I have some difficulty with the response. The people's democracy, and I'm talking here about one of the founding and leading members said to me one time that she missed the meeting where the PD decided to infiltrate the upper echelons of the bourgeoisie. That's the question. I didn't run into any former members of the PD in H blocks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8. I didn't run into any of them. Wasn't asked to follow any of them to Milltown or anywhere else. That's the question I would ask about those people, not the right to march at Burntollet and what happened to them, but what they did subsequent to that. And I think those are the questions that, and it hasn't changed. Let me tell you, it hasn't changed.
At the risk of repeating myself, August 69, the first march, peaceful situation. August 68 rather. August 69, the Bogside and hundreds of Catholic homes burned. In 1 year, you had a vast range of events. I wouldn't for a moment want to suggest that the Burntollet March was. It did raise, I think there's little doubt that it raised the sectarian temperature, but so did a whole lot of other things. Fazy's reaction to it. Craig was on the rampage, as Tommy said. Brian Faulkner wanted to get O'Neill's job. Paisley was exploiting every opportunity. There were a whole range of factors that raised the temperature, which culminated, I think, in the burnings in Belfast in August '69. Why we mention the PDs is because that was a part of the civil rights movement, and there was this distinction between the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, the NICRA, which was a very broad thing, which had a civil rights program, wanted to stick to it, and then the new grouping, the People's Democracy, which, to quote McKearney again, it was a loose organisation without formal membership and with an incoherent ideology comprising middle-class liberalism, aldermaster pacifism, and a Sorbonne-inspired belief in spontaneity. At its core was a small group of determined left-wingers who had been in close liaison with the Labour left in Derry, etc., etc. So that he describes the early civil rights movement, but then they stood for election in February '69. The leadership decided they turned themselves into a political party, and they did quite well. And then in April '69, in the by-election at Westminster, Bernadette Devlin got elected as a unity candidate from Mid-Ulster, but she essentially was a People's Democracy person. So there was a division in the civil rights movement, and the People's Democracy were looking for the advanced demands, of course, reflecting its left-wing leadership, McCann Company, demands that went beyond the civil rights demands. They were looking for one person, one vote instead of one person, they were looking for one person, one job rather than one person, one vote. They wanted socialism and wanted it quickly. And that, of course, caused a lot of confusion too. So these were divisions in the civil rights movement. But all of these elements, and the unionist responses, the loyalist responses, Craig's responses, the undermining of O'Neill by the UVF, who planted the first bombs, all of these raised the sectarian temperature in that 1 year. And you can argue, the historians can argue till Tibbs' Eve about who was responsible for this and what was responsible for that. But as Bobby Heatley said to me, as I quoted him earlier, the temperature rose and there's going to be an explosion anyway, you know, in his opinion. But whether, I mean, NICRA was not able, the Civil Rights Association was not able to maintain hegemony over events. That's certainly true. And as Regis say, if it had all started 3 years earlier, before the sectarian temperature had built up, because between 65 and 68, Paisley got more wind behind his sails, the Republicans got more impatient, a younger generation got more impatient, etc., etc. But these are speculations. What if? But is that what happened in that 1 year? And no one suggested that the People's Democracy it was just one element in a complex situation.
Yeah, just like this part of this meeting is to remember the 5th of October. And one of the infamous images of the 5th of October is your man Majimsey with his blackthorn stick beaten all around him, the RUC man, Inspector Majimsey. And the police were clearly part of the civil rights problem and had to be addressed, and were a major component of what civil rights was demanding. And as a consequence of that, in '69 you had the Hunt report, and the Hunt report made a number of recommendations that didn't go the full hog. Like, for example, although it proposed the abolition of the B specials, they were replaced by the Ulster, whatever you call them, the Ulster Defence Regiment, which in many ways were the Mundra. Tony talks about civil rights well, they were the B specials reborn. But one of the positive things, and I don't think people in this room, and I'm probably a number of you'll think I'm talking a lot of nonsense, but it's true, that the RUC were disarmed for a brief period. And they went out and they went into the Falls Road and they went to the Shankill Road unarmed as part of those reforms. But by 1971, they were back armed again, and this time they had flak jackets as well. Now that was an achievement, and then those achievements were taken away. Now, you know, and this lady here, like, one of the things, there was an independent of what was going on in the north. In the late 60s, there were, Eddie would remember this, housing agitations and all the rest of it in Dublin. The same sort of principle. And there was no question or doubt about it, but the powers that be down here were afraid that it was going to go. But then if you look at, as the situation became more violent in the north, how did the political situation in the 26 counties develop? You had the rise of Conor Cruise O'Brienism, you had historical revisionism, you had all the negative things that went on, which was one of the spin-offs, I would suggest, of the abandonment of civil rights and the replacement by other forms of struggle.
You have any more contributions from the floor? Okay, on that, I'll leave it so. There is the book launch